BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Today we're going back to the year 1985 to the nation of New Zealand, and we're going to be discussing the case that is referred to as the Monster of Mangatiti. This became also the title of a film that was put out on the subject. I saw the film back in 2018 on Netflix. I mean, they always take stuff up and put stuff down. You never know what their selection is going to be like in the coming months, but that's where I saw it. And I debated about doing an upload on the Monster of Mangatiti in 2019, but for some reasons we chose not to. However, yesterday on the channel we did an upload called War Machine, the Assault on Christy Mack, which was detailing some of the abuses that Christy Mack received from a domestic abuser in an abusive relationship. And I really got thinking a lot about the Monster of Mangatiti and some of the things that I had been wanting to say about that one in the past. This really is the story of an individual named Heather Walsh, who accepted a job to become an in-home tutor in New Zealand, and in a very rural area. And I gotta tell you, I'm a West Virginian, so please forgive me if I butcher any of these names. When I saw the name Mangatiti, to be honest, I thought it was going to be something Amazonian or Polynesian. Then when I clicked on the thing, even just on Netflix, when I first saw the name, it turned out New Zealand. I was quite surprised, but we always want to learn more about the world. And we're going to jump over to an article from the Whanganui Chronicle. Like I said, I'm going to be butchering a lot of names in this one. Whanganui, Whanganui Chronicle, that talks a lot about not only Heather Walsh, the Monster of Mangatiti, but as well as just what goes on in an abusive relationship in general. And the first thing that I would say is that we just got to bear in mind that we are going to be on the side of victims' rights. There are always two sides to the story, but at the same time, there's a big reason why we need to say there is no justification for what goes on. So stay tuned for that, because there's a big reason to talk about. One of at least 7 women subjugated to sexual violence by a figure of the remote Whanganui River tells her story on television in a new special called The Monster of Mangatiti, which is a 70-minute film that details the saga of Heather Walsh and her treatment by an individual named William Cornelius in the Mangatiti Valley during 5 months in 1985. William Cornelius faced 22 charges including rape and abduction in the Whanganui District Court in June 2012. 14 of the charges related to Mrs. Walsh's time in the Mangatiti Valley. And as you see, though, that's 2012, but these crimes occurred back in 1985. So the thing is, she accepts this job, and she first meets William Cornelius. And is he any kind of monster at the beginning? No, absolutely not. He's very pleasant, he's very charming, he is very welcoming. He puts her in this false sense of security. And I really like how this article here from the Whanganui Times really talked about that. They're like, abusers have the ability to put people into the false sense of security. And even yesterday when we did the upload War Machine, the Assault on Christy Mack, it's like, in that one, she said the abuse did not start immediately. It did not start until 3 months into their relationship. And continuing onward. Victims of sexual abuse always have their name suppressed, but Mrs. Walsh asked to have her name suppression lifted because she wanted people to know what Cornelius was like. She told a Chronicle court reporter that he had used his home against many young women. In that way, the girls who ride their horses in the valley or go down there will be warned. She spent years recovering from the 1985 ordeal and is now in control of her life, according to the program's executive producer, Philly DeLacy. Mrs. Walsh is now working with another sexual abuse survivor, Louise Nicholas, as an advocate for victims. But the thing is, though, it's like, this was a very different story than a lot of the other ones that I had seen detailing abuse. And because this is a true story, I mean, I always say I never like to give away things from movies, but if you ever get a chance to watch the film, The Monster of Mangatiti, it's more about half documentary and have film. Like, they have very long, drawn-out scenes that are performed by the actors, much more so than any sort of dramatic recreation in a documentary film. But the real Heather Walsh is in there, and she gives her own narration, and she is giving her own side of the story. You'll see the not fictionalized, but the dramatic recreations that actors are portraying, and then Heather Walsh will talk about the true events. So it has both of the things going on at once. But I got to tell you, this is a case of abuse. And at first, we said William Cornelius is being very charming, being very welcoming, right? And Heather Walsh and William Cornelius actually have consensual sex, consensual intercourse at first, the first time. And then the abuses would really go on to escalate from there. He was grooming her for later on, Miss DeLacy said, that's the producer. Then came rape, starvation, threats of torture, and death. The young woman became pregnant, but miscarried. Finally, she escaped by stealing a utility while Cornelius and a friend were out hunting. But there's a big thing they left out there, because this story, the Monster of Mangatiti, it was really something that I had never seen before. So, Heather Walsh is being abused. As you heard, he starts with holding her food, she is raped, she is beaten, and she's under the threat of death. However, we mentioned, though, that she's working in the house as a tutor, a private tutor for his son. So, what happens is, she convinces him to drive her back home, to drive her back to her house. And if this were a Hollywood movie, you'd think, oh, there's some type of intricate escape plan. But because this is a true story, I just couldn't believe what I was watching. He drives her back to her home. She gets inside her own home. She tells him something like, I just need more underwear. I need my things from home. She gets in the house, sees her mother. And then her mother's like, what's going on? She's like, no, don't come outside, because she's afraid that William Cornelius will do something to her mom. So she's trying to tell her mom about the abuse, but she's in this state of fear, this state of panic, and perhaps not thinking very clearly. Once she gets back outside to the car, William Cornelius completely changes his personality, and by Heather Walsh's own words, he was that charming, comforting, persuasive personality from the beginning. All of the fear went away for a second. He's telling her everything will be different. He's telling her that everything will be better this time. So she gets back in the car with him, back in the truck rather, and they drive back to the Mangatiti Valley. She had the opportunity to escape. She gets inside her own home, sees her mother, but then chooses to go back. It's the conditioning of abuse, really. And this is what they really wanted to say in this article here. I believe that that's like the thing that they were trying to convey. This is somebody who was grooming her to become the victim of abuse. And as I said very clearly, William Cornelius had done this before. He is somebody who was very sharp when it came to this particular method, which is not a good thing. It's actually a very bad thing. I mean, like, it's an absolutely heinous and disgusting thing. But I couldn't believe my eyes when I was watching that, the whole plan is to escape, is to get away from this abuser. And the fact that she got in her own home, was able to get to her mother, then voluntarily chose to walk back out and get in the car with him and go back to the life of abuse. Oh yeah, by the way, he didn't change. He continued the streak of abusive behavior. I think that was, rather predictable to us. To us as the outsiders looking in, watching a movie and reading the articles online and perhaps listening to podcasts, that seems rather obvious. But for somebody in the position of Heather Walsh, I mean, I believe what they're really trying to say is the victims of domestic abuse are groomed in a way, or they're conditioned in a way to go along with things that they would not normally accept. And to continue onward with our article here, his remote farming venture was profiled on Country Calendar in the early 1980s. The Holmes show was back in the later part of the decade when Cornelius was having a feud with a neighbor. The Monster of Mangatiti crew already knew that some of the stories of the back blocks in the Ruatiti Valley, excuse me. They had a show about the disappearance of Lionel Russell from nearby in the Mangapura Valley of 1975 after talking to Cornelius's nephew. When she heard how Cornelius kept women captive, Miss DeLacy wondered how such a thing could happen in New Zealand. How could such a thing happen? Well, the easiest way to say is that it's just global. I mean, it happens absolutely everywhere in the world. What are those some of those place names we mentioned at the beginning? The Amazon, Polynesia. These things definitely do happen on a global level. It's just from certain parts of the world we don't always hear about it that much. But one of the reasons why the producer says that a crime like this, where someone would be held captive for 5 months, being raped, abused, and tortured, what happened in New Zealand is the isolation of the Mangatiti Valley. That's one of them. And also, it allowed him to hold those women in a very vulnerable position. It was an environment that he controlled. So that's what they say about the isolation of the Mangatiti Valley. Another effect was psychological abuse. This is the perhaps more important one. What really intrigued me about this case is that it explores the psychological breakdown of a victim. He was a master manipulator. You could ask why she didn't leave, but it's not that simple. We've got a massive issue with domestic violence in New Zealand, and the film, hopefully, goes some way to explain it from the victim's point of view. And I think there's something very valuable about that, because I don't necessarily think the complete outsider would really comprehend all of the things about conditioning, about just living in fear, about how someone is slowly grooming this person to become subservient to them through the use of fear. And this is a very common tactic that we see with domestic abusers, and it's featured all throughout the forms of true crime literature, where someone really believes if they go against this person that either they could die or their family members could be murdered. This stuff happens all the time. Judge David Cameron decided he was mentally unfit for trial. Oh, actually, there's one more segment before that. It took 4 years for Mrs. Walsh's approach to get to the police. In 2008, they got the charges brought against Cornelius. By that time, he was 79 years old and suffering from early-stage dementia. Judge David Cameron decided he was mentally unfit for trial, but that, on the balance of the probabilities, there was enough evidence to find he committed the offenses he was charged with. He was allowed to return to his remote valley under supervision and died there a few months later. So as you see, though, they first brought the charges against him in 2008, years after this occurred in 1985, but as we said at the beginning, he did this to at least 7 other women. So he was a serial abuser, and no matter who a person is, no matter what has happened to them, we had that line from the film The Gray Man talking about Albert Fish, the movie The Gray Man, where one character says, sometimes you can't look at what happened to someone, and you just have to look at who they are. And that's definitely what would happen to somebody like William Cornelius in this story of the Monster of Mangatiti, where you see that, yes, there are going to be 2 sides to the story, and it's most likely at some point in his life he was the victim of abuse. I mean, talk about the cycle of destructive behaviors. But the reason why it's not justifiable is, it's what we said when we were discussing the book Life Code. The abuser is continually abusing a person, consciously abusing the person. They know what's happening when they're beating them. They know what's happening to them when they're issuing death threats. That's why it is not justifiable, and that's why there is no sympathy, and that's why there is absolutely no justification of any kind for this type of abuse. Very simply, because the abuser has so many opportunities to stop, and they're just doing it because of repetition, habit, their own broken personality, indifference to other people, apathy. Perhaps in some cases you have certain examples of sociopathic and narcissistic tendencies, psychopathic tendencies if they're born with them. There could be an entire host of issues about what is causing this person to behave in this destructive way. But that's not even the point when it comes to domestic abuse, because they have the conscious ability to choose not to do that. And every time he is abusing her, he is aware of it. I mean, he was at the time in 1985, of course. By 2008 to 2012, when after the trial and all of that, as they said, he was in the stages of dementia, so he would have had less awareness, and he passed away shortly after that. But at the same time, though, if anything, Heather Walsh was able to share her story, and that would just bring a little bit more of these discussions and raise more awareness for people who could become the victims of abuse, as well as getting more people just to understand that we can't always blame the victim. I told you, I was shocked when I saw her on the film go into her mother's house and have the possibility to get out, but then she voluntarily chose to return to her abuser, and I was surprised. And I think there's a difference between being surprised and encouraging it. I don't blame her for a second. Being very clear, I would not blame her for a second if that happened, because it's how the abuser uses fear and persuasion tactics to manipulate the victim. I just had never heard a story exactly like that before, when someone had such a clear escape route. And as we read one line off here, rather in the middle, but yes, eventually the way that Heather Walsh did escape was, while William Cornelius was out hunting with someone, she did steal a vehicle and she was able to drive to safety, and that time she did not return. But you really see, though, people are going to use a variety of persuasion tactics. And one of the first and foremost is what she said at the beginning about William Cornelius, about being charming and very good treatment at the beginning. And it's exactly what we said about how Christy Mack was describing, that the abuse did not start until 3 months into the relationship. And if it started at a much earlier time, most likely she would not have gone along with it. I mean, this is something that is very much calculated. And this is one of the things, though, what deals with conscious awareness of the abusers. It's most likely, yes, that they do have some traumatic experiences in their own life that have pushed them to behave this way. But once you sort of look at the calculation in their thought process, the awareness in their thought process, that they know if they start the abuse after day number 4, that the person in the relationship with them is going to be saying, this is a bad idea and I'm not staying with you. They are very much aware of that. That's why it happens, for example, 3 months into the relationship that we said, or just these very manipulative persuasion tactics. And, somebody like William Cornelius, it's really just a shock. Like, you think about that. Someone can become a master manipulator to that level. Someone can become a master manipulator of that proportion. Why use all your ability for destruction? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because of most likely repeating the cycle of destructive behaviors, repeating the cycle of abuse, as well as greed, selfishness, and as we mentioned, indifference to human life. All of those things. But the abuser is the one at fault. There is no justification. The victim should be portrayed as a victim. Sometimes we will find things in these stories that surprise us. However, though, the blame needs to be put on the abuser. They were the one who was in the wrong. Well, that's all I have to say about this one. This is the story of the Monster of Mangatiti that was made into a 2012 film. I saw it on Netflix, and perhaps it's available at a few other outlets. And I have to say, sorry once again for butchering some of these names from New Zealand. A lot of consonants and a lot of vowels. Well, that's all for me now. If you have anything to say at all about this particular one here, and right now, I would really like to invite anybody who has their own personal story to share. If there's anything that you would like to share about your own personal life regarding abusers, I think that it's a good thing to share. More than welcome. Please drop a comment below. I would love to hear from you guys. If you like this upload, you can hit the like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, you're welcome to do so. But please, let's talk more.